We will be recording tonight's program so that it will be available on Westminster's YouTube channel. So I would like to again welcome all of you for joining us. And I'll introduce our speaker for the evening, who is Dave Gula. And his position is as a principal planner for the Wilmington Area Planning Council, WILMAPCO. And he's been there since 2005, but was pointing out to Bob and me before we all started that he's actually worked with DART in the city for a long time. So is very knowledgeable about Wilmington, not at the time the interstate was constructed, but certainly in a lot of the years since. He is managing Wilmington Initiatives, which is a partnership between DelDOT, DTC, WILMAPCO, and the city of Wilmington. And that group meets every month to discuss and coordinate transportation issues and projects in the city. And he manages some community-based projects in Newcastle County, Wilmington, and Cecil County. And he is responsible for the Bridging I-95 project, which we'll be discussing this evening, and also currently manages the Union Street reconfiguration and streetscape study. So there are a number of studies underway. Our interest tonight is in the area of a project that potentially involves what they call capping I-95. And I think we're all really interested in hearing more about that. Having said that, I'm going to start by giving a little bit of historical perspective on the interstate system itself and the impact that it had, the context, the background, the impact it had during construction and since then. And then Dave will talk specifically about Wilmington. I would ask during the presentation portion if you could all mute yourselves as we're doing the recording. That would be most helpful. Otherwise, your picture is going to keep popping up on the recording. So there's an incentive to be quiet. So to put things in perspective here, the end of World War II marked the start of an economic boom in the United States. And of particular note was the increased demand for housing and for automobiles. This was also a time of pervasive Jim Crow legislation across the country, not just in the South. And it perpetuated both the segregation of the races and widespread discrimination against Negroes, which was the term in common use at that time. The GI Bill famously purported to provide education and housing opportunities for all veterans, but due to a provision that placed the responsibility for administering the bill on the states, most Black veterans could not take advantage of its provisions. And in fact, of the mortgages granted under the GI Bill, less than 2% went to Black veterans. In addition, the Federal Housing Administration, since its inception in 1934, had relied on 239 residential security maps, which were created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They were focused on every major US city, and these maps were intended to identify high-risk communities. And by high risk, that meant high risk of mortgage default, since the FHA insured loans, mortgage loans that were issued by banks. And these high-risk locations were virtually all synonymous with what was called inharmonious racial groups. And so the term for these areas was redlining. So this is an example of a redlining map, a Homeowners Loan Corporation map. This is Oakland, California. This is the 1937 map. It codified patterns of racial segregation and disparities in access to credit. So the green areas were labeled best. The blue were labeled desirable. The yellow areas were called definitely declining, and the red areas were labeled hazardous. One original FHA evaluator's report for Boyle Heights in the Oakland area read, "This is a melting pot area and is literally honeycombed with diverse and subversive racial elements. It is seriously doubted whether there is a single block in the area which does not contain detrimental racial elements. It is hazardous residential territory and is accorded a general medial red grade. It had nothing to do with safety. It had nothing to do with financial ability to manage a mortgage. It had to do with inharmonious racial groups. And even today, differences in the level of racial segregation, home ownership rates, home values, and credit scores are still apparent where those boundaries are drawn. So that's the setting. Given the explosive demand for automobiles in suburban housing after the war and concern about national security, President Dwight Eisenhower recognized the need for higher volume transportation options. So his administration formulated and implemented the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This was the largest public works program in US history, and it authorized construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways that would span the nation. And it authorized $26 billion to cover 90% of the cost of construction. And so the states and local organizations only needed to contribute 10%. During the initial construction period, more than 475,000 families, more than 1 million people, were displaced from their homes, their property seized by eminent domain. And the vast majority of those affected were low-income people of color in urban core areas. So where you saw those red sections on the Oakland map and other city maps, invariably, that was the path taken for the construction of the interstate highway system. In addition to furthering the goals of Jim Crow segregation legislation in certain areas, decisions on the siting of interstate highways through urban areas were influenced by the desire to clear out slums and to open up vast tracts of land for other purposes. So this was at the same time as this Poplar Street Project A that I mentioned in Wilmington that leveled blocks of homes in the community of color in Wilmington. But in many instances, in reality, these slums were actually lower middle or middle class communities, and they were identified as slums strictly because of the complexion of the residents. And in addition, the timing coincided with what was later proven to be faulty thinking about urban renewal, which came to be colloquially referred to as Negro removal. And because all of this occurred before the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, many minority communities lacked the political knowledge or capability to combat the actions of state and local government. And so it's difficult to overstate the negative impact of these highway projects on communities of color in many of our cities. When a project and its routing was announced, population loss from those urban areas accelerated and property values fell even before demolition and construction began. When looked at from an environmental justice perspective, those areas adjacent to highway construction faced significantly increased air and noise pollution. In countless circumstances, the neighborhoods directly affected were effectively isolated from the rest of the urban area, and local businesses were decimated as these communities were cut off from the broader population. And so that is indeed part of what we face in the city of Wilmington. This is an aerial view of I-95 through the city. And in this area here, the Adams-Jackson Street corridor where I-95 was built, that's the area that we are talking about tonight. What is happening in Wilmington in terms of discussing possibilities of rectifying the damage These conversations are being held in other cities as well, and I suspect Dave will talk a little bit about that. But the question for us, and specifically here in Wilmington, what is our hope for the future? So Dave, let me turn it over to you.
Okay. First, I had to put on headphones. There was a little bit of noise there. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, let me share my screen. And get this presentation underway. So for Wilmington, we will talk a little bit about the history or what was lost as I-95 went through, but really the focus of our presentation, and this is the presentation or very similar presentation to what we used for our public workshop that we held just November 17th. Really, the goal is more to think about the future. So yeah, your segue with your last slide, Sue, was very good because it kind of showed what are we doing to try to make things better in those neighborhoods. But I'll get started, and basically I'll walk you through the site history and what was taken. We're going to look at some other projects. As Sue mentioned, there are cities around the country that are replacing their highways or building over their highways, lots of different ways to do it. So we'll look at some of those, and then we'll talk about our approach and some of our analysis and the scope and timeline of the presentation. And I would like to have a discussion and give everyone a chance to comment on, just whatever strikes you as we go through the process. So we do have an advisory committee. I think it's made up of 35 people, roughly. What we tried to do, we knew we needed the elected officials to be involved in the process. We definitely needed the state officials and elected officials as well, but we also really wanted to make sure that we hit the neighborhoods that are around the area. So we reached out through United Neighbors and through Westside Grows to as many of the communities that directly abut I-95, Cool Springs, and I'll show another slide that talks about that. Our project partnership is WILMAPCO, DelDOT, and the city of Wilmington. DelDOT approached WILMAPCO probably about going on a year plus ago to look at this project and be the partner who manages the process. So we're working with DelDOT. We've got their full approval and partnership as we go forward, which is always good when you start in that way. We do have some of these projects that start out as grassroots, and then you've got to kind of sometimes bring everybody in, whether they're really on board at the beginning or not. In this case, we have full state support as we move forward, which is a really good way to start. And we have a project team that we brought in from, they have a New York office, they have a San Francisco office. It's Hargreaves Jones. They are the prime consultant for us, and they're actually a landscape architecture firm. They paired with JMT, which is an engineering firm. So the idea is to have a firm that knows what these new spaces that these reclaimed spaces look like as parts of other projects. And the engineering firm is the firm that actually will make sure that whatever we build is feasible and will actually have full support of a structural nature so that everything we want to do, we can do. We also brought in a facilitator working with DelDOT from Jacobs Engineering. Her name is Toyin, and so she'll also be working with us as we go through this process, helping us with public outreach. These are a few precedent images just up the road, just up I-95, in fact, in Philadelphia. Penn's Landing is looking at an expansive cap that's 12 acres. It will go from Front Street all the way to the river. There are some very challenging engineering pieces to that project. We'll talk a little bit about it further on. And Hargreaves Jones actually is part of this. They actually helped design the cap for Penn's Landing. That project is actually getting close to construction. So that's one of the projects that's actually moving forward. You can see on the screen, there's a park, a similar type of park that was done in Moscow. And I have the name of that park because my Russian's not as good as some people's. And that is Zaryadye Park. So it's a similar situation. And also Hargreaves worked on that one and also worked in London on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which has a similar nature in terms of how it was reclaimed land. So those are things that we wanted. It was important to us to have a firm that's done this work before. We haven't, and we want to make sure that we have not just the local perspective, but we need that national perspective and national teams that have done the work in other places and had success. So, tell me I'm not frozen. I was frozen. All right, hopefully we're back. Okay, great. I didn't miss anything, did I? Let's make sure. All right, we're good. Okay, so for context, as I pointed out, we wanted to reach out to the neighborhoods that are directly around the I-95 project, and you can see it outlined here in red. So we have representation from Cool Springs, Trinity vicinity, the West Center City, Quaker Hill. We have actually worked with Hilltop Lutheran Church, and we've been working with Westside Groves from West Hill. So we've reached out and gotten as many folks as we can involved, because it's not just the neighboring communities, but the communities all around that we want to make sure have input on the process. And this gives you some historical perspective. This shows the path of I-95 and what buildings you see in pink are the buildings that were eliminated as this project went through this section. Overall in Wilmington, I think 340 structures were demolished as the highway was being constructed. And it was actually quite a mix. At the time, it was 80% white, 20% minority as this went through. I actually, one of the gentlemen I work with, the city of Wilmington, remembers being in 4th grade, I think, when he was told that they were going to have to move from Front Street. So it did affect all walks of life. There were a lot of commercial, there were some commercial structures lost. There were some institutional structures lost, but this gives you a better idea of what actually was in the place as the project moved forward. And I don't have a link to it, but I can send it to Sue. There was a really good project done through the Delaware Delaware Historic and Cultural Institute. I'll send it to you. They did a really nice presentation on like much more depth on what was there and what was lost. And I think they recorded 2 webinars. So I'll send a link to Sue that can be distributed. But this just gives you an idea. Also looking at the city, this is looking from the west. And this is directly what was supposed to be built. One of the things that we saw in the original plans for I-95 was sort of a park-like, I wouldn't call it a full adaptation, but there was supposed to be a park-like, surroundings as it went through, which if you are familiar with the area, there's not really park-like along there. There's a lot of green, but it's not really usable on the slopes down to the highway through this canyon that was developed. So the neighborhood certainly did not get a benefit from this as it went through. And this shows you actually all the structures that were there. And then this is show you further in the destruction in 68 and how the density grew around it as we've moved forward. So we're hoping to see that, those really dense neighborhoods that don't have a lot of green, maybe this is the chance to get them something that fills in those gaps for them. So here's where we talk about some other areas where things were done. We haven't necessarily said this has got to be a park. We really want the community to determine what goes on in this space and how much of the space could actually be capped. When you talk about a cap, if you look at this, you would basically be talking about the space between these streets that would just be a much larger bridge that could support whatever is needed to, or whatever we choose as we move forward. Now you do have a couple of sections where there are ramps that make things challenging, but the key is we want to look at this, and we want the community is going to have the final say on what happens through that advisory committee. And it's kind of rare. You don't always see that kind of power given to an advisory committee, but DELDOP's point and the state's point was really, the impact is going to be felt as a positive way. The impact will be felt with this community, and they should have every chance to be the determining factor on what actually could be built. So we haven't said park, we're not determining what it is. We know there might be some limitations with what uses could go in there because you are over a federal highway. So you can't necessarily have a for-profit or a developer building, market rate housing above it. I don't know if you could do some kind of subsidized housing. We haven't gotten to that point yet to look at it. We do know that in Philadelphia and Penn's Landing, there was a lot of documentation necessary to get a nonprofit cafe and an ice skating rink that are going to be built as part of their cap. And so we know there are things that can be done, but we really don't want to influence yet what the community chooses to see here as a use. So here are a couple of other potential comparisons. This is Kanawha Plaza in Richmond over I-195. It shows you just a big open space that can be used for gatherings and some plantings. In Dallas, there's a park called Clyde Warren Park that actually went between downtown and an arts district. So it's flanked by museums, and it really became a really nice outdoor space. You see there's a big lawn area, but there is also a lot of programmed areas for playground and other different things. There's a cafe. So there are lots of uses that could go in. Now that wasn't a federal highway, it's a state highway, so they had a little more control over the uses above. And it also didn't border neighborhoods as ours will. So that's something that we have to focus on as we go in, that this is a lot of the places that these caps go up, they're bordering right into downtown or as I said, adjacent to an arts district, not actually residential communities. So that's something we want to keep in mind as we move forward. There's a Southern Gateway Park, also Dallas, Texas, on some reclaimed land. And then if anyone remembers the Big Dig, which I don't necessarily want to model after in Boston, because of the way that there's a lot of complications with that project. But the final product is, I think, a mile and a half or more of green space that was added as they basically built a full tunnel. Now, we may not be looking at a tunnel, and that has a lot of different complications to do a tunnel versus a shorter, a couple of block cap. So we're keeping our options open, but we are looking at other projects just so that we can kind of anticipate what the challenges might be. Here's another look at the Penn's Landing. As I said, Hargreaves and Jones helped to design this project. This is a 12-acre cap. You can see there's an ice skating rink set up here. There's a couple of small one-story structures, cafe, restaurant style. And then once you get back over land, there's some other things that they'll do. But there's a lot of program space. There's areas for walking, areas for sitting and contemplating. There's some playground spaces. And one of the things that we wanted to point out is when they were designing this, they actually knew that, you're going to have a deck and you're going to have I-beams that have to span the area that's spanned. But between those I-beams, you could actually create a deck that provides you more space for trees, because you can't necessarily pile, 4 feet of dirt over top of the deck that you want to build, because it then changes the complete topography of the area. So you might be able to engineer it so that you would have these deeper trenches where you could have trees that would be able to root, as opposed to thinner areas where you could have grass and shrubbery. So it's just gives you an idea of the complexity that's necessary to make sure that the engineering structure supports whatever the use is above it. But it also shows you that there's some flexibility to that. And that's one of the goals for us, is to, again, maintain the flexibility as we go through this process of listening to the community. So that's another look at what they're going to have and as they finish their work. And again, this was Hargreaves and Jones that helped design this, and construction should be starting in the next 6 months, I believe. So here's how we're going to handle things as we go forward. We see this as an opportunity. The reason we titled this project Bridging I-95, Reconnecting the Community, is because we don't want to reconnect communities. This is one community, and it was one point. And so the goal is to reconnect it and create as many connections as part of this process. Again, we're looking back at, it's not just what's over I-95, but you also have Jackson and Adams streets, which have become very busy streets that supply, more space for cars getting to and from I-95. And while we're not able to alter the way I-95 runs through Wilmington, we can certainly alter the way those streets function and make them more neighborhood friendly, help to slow traffic on them, and make them easier for pedestrians to cross. Because what we don't want, what would be a waste, is to build a very nice public space over I-95 that people can't really get to comfortably, just walking or riding a bike. And so the goal is that reconnection means that you have to focus on not just the structure and what you want to build, but how you want to be able to get people to it easily and make it part of the community, not just another barrier or a continuation of the existing barriers. So this is a collaboration and really building on the efforts of local groups that have, if you've been out there, you've seen that those 3 bridges now that have been painted. That's a grassroots effort. It was led by United Neighbors in partnership with Westside Grows to try to beautify the community, with what's already there. And we want to make sure that we harness that, not just the energy, but the same folks who are involved. You don't want to replace those folks and bring in other people to try to tell them what to do. So really the goal is to bring the people who have already been involved, bring them into this process and help them to figure out what works best for them and what will look best for this community. So this is really is a joint part. It's a partnership. It's a real good chance to try something different. And it is a beginning of something new for this area. So our project approach is that, again, listening and learning and the collaboration piece. We want to consider that Wilmington's history could also be a part of the focus of this public space. We've seen in other cities in Columbus, Ohio, in particular, there's a wall that was used to kind of portray the history of the roadway that went through there. And so they have some notable city historical monuments along that wall. But our other goal is to just listen to the community and help them create this vision. And the way we build trust is to start in the community. So we've already had 2 meetings for the advisory committee, which is largely made up of community groups, people who live in the community. We may actually also be able to put together a few stakeholder working groups as we get closer to some ideas. But we've had our first public workshop that was in person on November 17th. And the next goal for us is to have a virtual workshop for folks who couldn't attend or who weren't comfortable being in person at this time with COVID and the pandemic that seems to be resurging a little bit. So the goal is to make sure that everybody who's interested will be able to have access to this Zoom workshop. So we're going to try to structure the Zoom workshop to be very close to what we did in the in-person workshop, so folks get the exact same kind of opportunities to help us figure out what will work best in this area. And so the questions that we're asking are what would it be? What would it look like if we successfully connected these communities? And then we also have to ask, what are the obstacles that we have to overcome? And how much of this, not just art and parks, but also the transportation infrastructure. As I said, if you build something that is really not safe to walk to or bike to, and you always have to drive, you're not really connecting the community. You're just creating yet another obstacle. So the goal is to make sure that this has to be something that folks feel like it's their new front yard and it's easy to get to. We want to celebrate the local historical cultural identity. We want that input from the community to help us with that. And then we also have to think about what's needed to unite the interest. And really, we have to develop our advisory committee really has to come together and really come to consensus on what best serves the community. And they do that by interacting with the folks in their neighborhoods and interacting with us and all of us working together to try to get somewhere. It has to be sustainable. And again, I think a lot of people want it to be show some sort of regional, not just something that could just pop up anywhere, but something that really echoes the value of the community in Wilmington. So our group will be working on, they'll have 8 different site visits. As I said, the main consultant team is from out of the state. And so we're working closely with them. We do have a local piece for the sub-consultant. We will have at least 6 advisory committee meetings and 4 community workshops. And as we go through, we've already talked about working on the visioning to design the options, and then looking at the feasibility of the options and the cost to come to a final design. And really, the goal is, again, the idea of branding it, bridging I-95, reconnecting the community. I mean, we want that to be a brand that people can latch onto and think about. The idea of saying I-95 cap structure, it just doesn't really it doesn't inspire any real vision. It's just the structural piece, which is very important, but the idea really is to develop what's going to happen over top of that. There are a couple of key points. The I-95 is not going to be rerouted as has happened in some other cities, and we're not going to be closing any portions of it. There was, as I-95 rehab project has been underway, as you all are aware, for the last year, there was one ramp interchange that was reconfigured. There is potentially a few minor changes we can make, and we will make sure that all these ramps that are currently here have to be here. But as far as the route is going to continue. It's going to remain an interstate highway through the city of Wilmington. And the other promise we're making is that we are not looking at private property. We aren't going to displace residents. We're trying to make our impacts positive and minimal. So while our project boundary is really the outside curbs of Adams Street and Jackson Street, the bridge at Delaware Avenue and the bridge at 6th Street, we may be able to carry some positive like streetscapes or things like that into the community, but the goal is not to touch any private property. So we've done some preliminary mapping of the study area, and it's a 2,500 foot span if we were to cap the entire study area, and that goes from 6th Street to Delaware Ave. That may or may not be possible. You have this ramp that comes up off I-95 and goes to 11th Street. You'd have to make allowances for that if you were putting a cap in this area. There's also the ramp that comes up from, I guess it begins around 4th Street and comes up to 8th Street. And then there's another on-ramp that starts at 9th Street and goes down. So we do have to be aware of what's out there. As I said, we aren't going to be able necessarily to close ramps or move those, especially not as the state is currently spending a very large sum of money and 2 years of work to try to reconfigure all that or rehabilitate all of those infrastructure pieces. So there is a total of 12 acres over this entire study area, and it's 300 feet wide. So it gives you an idea of what could be reimagined in these spaces. There is a grade of 6.75% here at 7th Street. And then I think on the next slide, it tells us there's slightly less of a grade change. And this is from Jackson to Adams. At 10th Street, it's only it's hard to read, it's 3.65. So there's a little topography. If you're looking at this is looking south to north. Again, this is Jackson, this is Adams. It does slope a little bit. That could actually be something that could be a positive because it would give you a view shed from one side of this project looking towards the downtown. So it's just, again, another piece of the geography that we need to keep track of. This slide basically shows all the bus routes that do operate in and around the area. We certainly don't want to impede bus movement and bus service. In fact, one of the things, if this is really a community park, that bus service could be a great way to get people to and from the park. So we absolutely will be looking at how transit can be incorporated into whatever is built here. Another thing we want to incorporate is the Wilmington bike plan that was just adopted back in 2020, and it shows the bike routes, the best proposed bike routes through the area in green, which shows the surface streets that we're dealing with. Because if you're aware of the traffic at Delaware Avenue, it's a really challenging place for you to try to ride a bike. 4th Street is similar. Now 4th Street's got some work undergoing that's going to make the section from I-95 to King a little more bike friendly, but even I've done some studies of Delaware Avenue to 12th Street, and there are real challenges if you're trying to ride a bike there. So there's a lot of work that still would have to be done. Key piece being, these streets here are they're lower volume, they're lower speeds, they're much more suited for bike movements. And so you don't want to, you'd like to have that connectivity with the bike plan. Also within 1 mile of the project area, there are 5 museums. There are 5 libraries, 11 schools. There's one directly adjacent to the corridor. That's the Lewis School. There are 20 places of worship, and I don't know why, for some reason, we don't show Trinity Church right here, which we should. Huge mistake there. I'll pick that up, but I believe that's probably Westminster's right over there. There are also 4 community centers that are in close proximity, and there are some other landmarks here, and some parks. I mean, right now, Cool Springs is a wonderful park that's directly adjacent to the study area. But if you're on the West Center City side, there aren't as many. The Barbara, it's not Barbara Hicks, it's right near the Hicks Community Center. There's another park right there, but it's a smaller park. It's more of a ball field than a park. Oh, sorry, it's the Helen Chambers Park. So here's what we did at our first advisory committee. And we asked a lot of questions. And I also would like, if we have time, to ask you some of the same questions as we go, when we wrap this up. But what are the things that make the project successful? And folks gave us some ideas, something that generates trip and activity, that brings energy to the corridor, improves the quality of life, helps restore the community, and is an amenity for the community and the neighborhood. Again, back to that connection idea, bringing together the different communities, connections of people and places, but also a project that the locals appreciate, again, because if we do it right and we're following all of the guidance that we get, then it will be a community vision that will be realized here. One of the concerns is not to necessarily boot people out of a park, that people who are experiencing homelessness or displacement, and certainly not to displace any other people. So you have to be careful with how you approach a community, but also a place for kids, for teens, somewhere where you've got activities. And so programming a space is also important. You don't necessarily just want to build a big wide open space. You've got to have some ideas and some programmed activities that folks can follow and enjoy. We were asked about what connections should be made here. One of the big keys was making a connection to Cool Springs, to and from Cool Springs Park. Another point that came up was between the Trinity Church and the parish cemetery. This intersection at Adams and Delaware Avenue is quite challenging right now. And really, if you start looking at the big picture, if you can connect whatever is built here to the cemetery, you're basically connecting it to Brandywine Park. And if you could complete that in phase 1, then the phase 2 would be, well, how do you connect this going south to the riverfront in Christina? And so this could be a real nice, a bigger piece, even than for the community. It could be a connection that the whole city could enjoy. So basically all the cross streets were shown as areas that people think are important to connect. And again, there's that Helen Chambers playground that I was struggling with the name. And there's a small street that I don't even know if it's paved at this point, that could connect directly to whatever is going on in this area, whatever is programmed. So these are some things that we did hear from our advisory committee. This is one of those word clouds. The way this works is, the larger the word is, the more often it was mentioned, and the smaller it is, the less often it came up. And in green, and this darker green, are the things that people really liked, and the closer you get to pink are the things that people were less interested in seeing here. So this kind of shows you that retail is not necessarily favored, and as I pointed out, it might be really difficult to put in retail that would be for profit over top of a federal highway, just for lots of different reasons. The federal highway controls the airspace over an interstate, and so we have to be careful with what's proposed. But the ideas of pedestrian-only areas, shade areas, potentially a cafe, or at least outdoor seating. One of the ways around that would be potentially an area where food trucks could pull up, but you'd want to have park-like space that people could enjoy their food. So that's another way to get around the idea of necessarily having a structure there. Public restrooms, though, if you're going to consider this to be a park that would really fit the community, then that's something you have to commit to. As I mentioned, the traffic calming on the streets that would be passing through and certainly alongside, because if you can't really get to the places that you want to get to, you haven't really solved your problem and you just propagated the problem that's already there. But some of the other pieces are a multifunction landscape, something that could be used, not necessarily a programmed sports type of use. I think that was something that popped up further down. Yeah, sports courts weren't really that popular. So the idea of just a lawn that could be used for kids to get together and play sports, but also could be used for community gatherings and things like that. Amphitheaters were brought up. But also, as I said, some of that history and, some interpretative areas for history, some art areas, a performance venue, potentially some kind of a landscaped amphitheater that could serve for community use. A flexible use lawn kind of goes back to that multifunction landscape. Art and sculpture have been brought up a lot. Potentially some shade areas and pavilions that could be for community use. So just looking at this, there are a lot of uses that we haven't narrowed down yet, but some of the, I don't know if an ice skating rink is going to be something that's going to pop up here based on some of the things we see here. But we're really this is the early part of the vision. So our schedule is to take the community feedback that we're getting. We have the first workshop. We have another workshop, as I said, a virtual workshop that will be held on January 12th. And I will forward that link also to Sue so she can spread it around to the folks on this meeting tonight. If you didn't have a chance to attend the in-person workshop, this is another opportunity to get your comments in early. And when we finish that visioning process, and we haven't set the official time to stop that, then we'll start developing concept based on what we heard. Since there may be federal dollars going into this, we'll use a purpose and need statement. So basically, we'll take all the things here and we'll put together a statement that says, why are we doing this? And what are we trying to accomplish? That also helps us then to put those kind of criteria that we heard from the community into, well, what is it we want to do? And then we will, once we have some concepts, we'll come back to our advisory committee, and then we'll go to a community workshop and say, here's some ideas. Tell us if these are on the mark, if they're off the mark, if we need to combine some of these ideas, or if there's other things we need to bring in. And we haven't gotten to the point of scheduling those things. And I think that would probably be late winter, spring. So probably March or April before we'd be ready to have those concepts. But the idea, again, is to come back to the community early and again, say, well, here are our first thoughts. You tell us if we're getting closer, if we need more work to do. And so here's kind of our schedule. It is sort of a year-long process. So if all goes well, by next fall, we'll be talking about the final options and how much those are going to cost. And that'll give us a better feel for, then where do we start looking for funding to get these things done? So the tasks that we have we're in the community vision, and then we will, again, define the assumptions, create some concepts, and then task 3 is to, once we've heard from the community what they think are the things that they would want to see, then we kind of look at what's of those things, how feasible are they, what's the cost to make them happen, and then you come back to the community and say, well, here's what you asked for, and here's some of the price tags on some of these items, and then you can also mix and match at that point with, well, these are, we may not like all of concept A or concept B, but we really like a hybrid of that. And that's really, again, this is driven, as you can see, by these workshops that make sure that we're coming back to the public for where we have questions and also to show results. I think that's what I've got. Now, here's a website. It's pretty simple if you know the WILMAPCO.org /I-95 cap /. And there's some history of I-95. There's the history of this project, how we got started, and really the updates. Every time we complete a workshop, the presentation goes up there. We have a recording of the workshop up there. We know there's a Hispanic population that's sort of in this side of the project and the further south. So we also recorded the workshop in Spanish, so we could have folks could actually click on that link if they are needed that translation. And so again, the goal is to try to just get as much interaction. I think at the moment there's still a survey up there, which is very similar to the questions that I showed you from the advisory committee. So that's another place where if you send that link to friends and neighbors, people you think are interested in the project, they can actually go through the survey and give us their feedback, which can be added to the vision. What I would like to do is kind of open it up to some conversation. And I'm going to go back to the questions that we asked so that you sort of have a little bit of the same structure that we used for our workshops, which are what would be a successful result? What are the things that this group thinks would be important to see in the final project? And you don't have to be shy, because I've even been yelled at, so wouldn't be the first time.
All right, we'll start. People can use the raise hand button if they want. Let's see, Dave, do you want to leave that screen up or?
Well, I'll flip through the other two, because I mean, I just want to like sort of get some feedback. So like I said, the first question is what would make the project successful? And it doesn't have to just be one word. And other things would be, where are we trying to connect? What are the areas that people would want to see that were easier to get to, or just have a flow? One of the things that I neglected to mention is early in this process, a University of Delaware professor who's professor of landscape architecture has a bunch of students, juniors and seniors, and she said, can I kind of hitch a ride on your project? And so next week, we're actually going to have the final presentation of their work. But they came to the first advisory committee and they took this same basic area and they created some of their own ideas. And most of the things that we saw were talking about getting folks that don't have a lot of green who live in this side to green here. And that connection should also be green. And so it's sort of like a way to lead people into a front yard, you know, for this neighborhood that also connects to the existing parks. And so that's where this other potential connection to the cemetery, which is basically a big open park, that would also lead you to Brandywine Park. So that's another piece of this, is what's important to connect to. And we did hear a little bit of the river to river connection. And then the last question would just be, what kind of amenities do you think would be very important for this neighborhood, for this community, for this area of the city? So I'll go back to the map because I think the map is helpful.
Okay, well, we'll start. I've seen two hands. I saw Roger's first and then Moira. So Roger, go ahead.
Thanks, Dave. Got a stack of questions. Let's start with one about home values in the area after the project, and also who rents there and who owns there and who's being consulted in your groups. Is it the homeowners, I mean the renters, or the people that own the homes if it's a rental unit?
Okay, I know that in this side of I-95, there's a lot higher percentage of rental. It could be anywhere from 7 to 80%, depending on which block you're on. I think further up here, it's more ownership. On this side of the block, I don't have the numbers as specific, but I know that it's a substantially lower number of it's not as large a rental population there. On the one hand, one of the things that concern us is we don't want to necessarily build this wonderful amenity and then suddenly see all these properties get sold and a big developer comes in and builds right here. And the folks who've been living in this area for a really long time with no amenities suddenly priced out of the equation. I have spoken to one of the city council members for this area. Very detailed conversations. Her concerns are the same thing. I mean, the term that people use is gentrification. One of the ways to avoid that is to put together, as part of the process, a community benefit agreement. And one of her requests was, is there a way that we could find funding for folks who wanted to improve the facade of their houses? and as a very low interest loan perhaps. And you're getting out of my area. I'm a transportation planner, so I didn't have the answer to her questions. But I did say there are people within the city who do have answers to those questions. I know, and at the state level as well. So it's something that we want to make sure that we're looking at as part of this. This is a partnership, and those city council people, we expect them to ask these kind of questions, and we help us. It's our job to help them find the answers and connect them to the people who would know those answers. So, Roger, I don't know if I've answered your question as well completely, but it's kind of as well as I can. The goal is really not to displace. When I say not displace people, I don't necessarily mean we're not just going to take property, but I also mean we don't want to then cause those folks to get moved out of the area because they can't afford to live here anymore. But as far as the input, I consider the population who lives there now as the population that we want to hear from. I mean, in a perfect world, those folks would still be able to continue to rent in this area and enjoy, just have a better amenity for their neighborhood. They wouldn't necessarily be the only ones. And I also know that some of the landlords in the area, I don't want to hear from, because some of the landlords in the area have not improved their properties for some time, and suddenly are going to be interested in, oh, how do I profit from this? So while I guess I don't necessarily want to hear from them, I want to work with, we're going to work with the city administration and city council to try to find ways that there's protections that are put in place for the neighborhoods.
Yeah, you probably might be seeing some effects already in rents and ownership and whatnot, that just on the breadth of whisper that it could be a project.
Yeah, and you're right. The closer we get to funding, the bigger that issue becomes. So I did put a couple of places in Wilmington. I think the closest thing I can point to, Roger, is the wetland park that's going in South Wilmington. This is adjacent to the Southbridge neighborhood. And that group also had a big concern about this wonderful new park coming in and what it would do to property values in the neighborhood. Really, if you own property, that's a wonderful thing. Your house suddenly becomes more valuable. But the problem is you don't want to see that then put an extra tax burden on. So the goal, we're not using city tax dollars to build this. So this isn't going to be something that suddenly causes the taxes to go up for the homeowners. It will be harder to protect the rentals, but I also think that's where we have to work closely with city council and city administration. So we're going to continue to do that. That's probably the best answer I could give you, but we are aware that there are going to be some challenges here.
Thank you.
Maura, I think you were next, and then Sandy.
Great, thank you, Sue. Dave, this is the best presentation I've heard on this so far. Thank you. I was listening to the part of your presentation where you were asking for what I would have called success factors. You know, what has to happen for this to be a successful project? And the thought I had was related to the reaction of the community that was affected when the highway was built. And I keep thinking, I hope there would be some sense, a strong sense of restoration that comes to that community. That's very soft. I appreciate it. But throughout all of your comments, I kept thinking, this is an opportunity to restore a community to at least what it was before, and perhaps something better. And so that would be my success factor. My other question, which I bet you can answer fairly quickly, is who's paying for this now, and where's the rest of the money going to come from?
Right. Well, part of the study that we're going through now is about a third of it is provided by WILMAPCO, and the other 2/3 are coming from the state through DELDA. So right now, the only thing that's involved in this is transportation funds. When we get to the point where we're going to be building something, I think the state will certainly have a stake in it, and there might be a small local match, but well, I'll put it this way. I've done a number of grants for transportation projects within the state. Usually it's a train station. Sometimes it's like I said, the wetlands park that's being done in South Wilmington. We were a little bit involved in that, at least with funding. And so for the most part, there might be a small amount of local funds, but really it comes from state and federal funds. So the goal for us is to make sure that we check all the boxes that the federal government requires for funding. And that's something that we are experienced with, and we're pretty sure we can deliver that. I think there was an interview, a press conference done right in the construction area a couple of weeks ago, where Representative Blunt Rochester spoke, and the current infrastructure bill actually has some funds in there for reconnecting communities dealing with just this type of situation. So those are funds that we'll certainly look to tap into. And I would say the positive, to try to shorten my answers and wrap up, is that the good news is we're not trying to convince the state that this is something that needs to be done. They're already convinced. So for us, let's figure out what we're going to do, how much it costs, and then we can move forward. That's always makes things much easier than when you've got to then go back and say, well, this is what the community said. What are you willing to do? The state's pretty much said, we know we need to do something, so let's figure out what it's going to cost and keep moving. So I would say the bulk of this is going to be federal and state funds.
Thanks. And when you say the state, do you mean the governor or Department of Transportation?
Department of Transportation, but I think when you start talking about the development of parks, that also we might see DNREC involved as well.
Oh, sure.
One of the keys, and I didn't mention this yet, is you have to have maintenance. You can't just build something and then walk away from it. We've all seen that happen. I think this might be too big for the city to suddenly have to say, okay, our Parks and Rec now has to be part of this. I certainly think they need to be part of it, but I also think that maybe the state and DNREC might have to be part of this to make sure that whatever's built, not only do you have programmable space, you got to make sure someone's controlling that program. Who do people contact when they want to use that pavilion, or if they want to set up a community event? So you've got to have some kind of a group. And in other cities, this has been done through nonprofits that are set up to handle this. There are consortiums that do it. You'd also like to have maybe some private interest in that, because then you could also perhaps get some private sponsorship of some of the spaces that you're doing. So the idea really is to try to make this a partnership, because that's how it'll work best. And really that ongoing maintenance piece is just as important as the actual construction.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I realize we're at our nominal endpoint, but we seldom end at the nominal endpoint. I know Sandy has her hand raised. So Sandy, the floor is yours.
I just wanted to say, in listening to your wonderful presentation, I'm so excited about the possibilities here. And one thing that popped into my mind, partly because I've read recently the book by Heather McGee, The Sum of Us, and she uses a metaphor of something that happened, which was in the 50s and 60s, swimming pools were closed rather than make them accessible to everybody. And right. In my mind, I just kept thinking, let's rebuild the swimming pool, figuratively and, I don't know, actually, because I didn't see it on the list. So if it's not something the people that are in that community want, then it shouldn't be on the list. But I can picture all the gathering that happens at a swimming pool and the joy and the relief of summer heat. And I don't know, I kept thinking, rebuild the swimming pool. So just wanted to make that comment. And I know recreation was on there, and that would take pretty major maintenance for sure. But is Cool Springs Park, can that be part of all the brainstorming that's going to happen with this? Because I know it's right there. And that gives you more area to work with if there are many ideas. So those were both a comment and maybe a question, because I'm curious about, that's a pretty big area, Cool Springs, and maybe yes, more ideas can be incorporated if that is open to revamping. Maybe the swimming pool could go there.
Right, that might be easier to construct for sure.
Right, I was thinking about the complication, but right. Anyway.
Well, we've not been told what's off limits at this point. And I think one of the things that when you build a park like this, you have some constraints. I mean, the reservoir offers some constraints in that you can only do so much. In this park, they just replaced this playground area, which is wonderful. And so having done that, and worried about the space, then yes, could this space be used for something different if this was a big lawn style green space? And so it's funny, some of the students actually looked at ways to change the roadways, like curves to the roads in a couple of different spots. And I thought that's wonderful, because what you do then is not only is that a traffic calming measure, when you put a curve in the road, you slow people down, they can't whip through here as fast. It also then changes. The one that I saw that I thought was really interesting was maybe in this spot where they just basically curved the road out and into the new space, which then means that some of this area here, some of these houses suddenly have a new yard attached or some green space directly attached to them. And so that could be a way to, again, drag those neighborhoods deeper into whatever is done here. Another thing that has been discussed is, do you really need all of the streets that go through? There are bus routes on 8th and 9th. I would hate to displace a bus route. It's really hard to reroute a bus when you've got one ways all throughout. But 10th Street, potentially, and all these have 2 lanes. Some of these could be narrower, and maybe 7th Street. That's one that keeps popping up, as maybe 7th Street doesn't go through anymore. And then you've got a much bigger space to work with, and you can work on that grid. So I think, to your point, maybe not the swimming pool, but the idea of a community gathering space that's really the goal. If you make something and no one comes, you haven't really done anything. So our goal is really to find a way to connect it better to the community, and create what they want, what they need. There have been some really neat images. A lot of it is with lighting. And when you do create a park space, if you don't light it properly, it's only good for some use. And in the winter, when days are so short, if you were to say, we're going to spend a whole lot of money on this, but you're only going to be able to use it in the winter for from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, you're not maximizing the space. And to have places to go in the winter that are outside, when you've got, some clear skies and some crisp temperatures, and food trucks could roll up, and it would be well lit enough that people would just be comfortable going in and out. That's really something that we've thinking about a lot. One of the residents at the workshop said, you could light up both sides of the corridor like Boathouse Row. And so not only do you build something new in the corridor, you would make improvements along the corridor. And that was kind of goes back to your point as well. Like, you create points of interest that people want to go and experience. So that's what we hope to do. The swimming pool idea, I'll keep that in the back of my head. Like you said, maybe for Cool Springs Park, if you had a lot of extra space adjacent to Cool Springs, then maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea at all. So we'll keep it in there.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, I think. Bob, you've had your hand up. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. David, outstanding presentation. When you were speaking about the idea of the pool, I read the same information. What jumped out at me was... Hello? Yes?
Hello?
Lucy?
Yes, I'm asking a question. I would like to know, did this committee that you work with, Dave, did they canvass the area and ask the people before they even seem like everything has already been decided? It's what did they say? And what kinds of things are we replacing that was taken away from them? What kinds of things?
Lucy, we're still in the process of talking to people. Nothing has been decided. The only thing that's probably decided is I don't think we're going to see housing or structures built above I-95. I think the complications with the federal government are going to be difficult to overcome. We've talked about community space. Maybe there are some structures that can be built that would be community owned and community, or at least at the state level owned, but could be used for community space. What was taken were houses and institutions and things that we frankly can't replace. But what we can do is try to, as one of the students said, kind of put a really nice bandage on what was a wound so that it doesn't look like a wound anymore. And that's again, we haven't decided anything. We're still dealing with we're still working with the community and still hearing from them. And this is part of that outreach tonight. So I don't want you to feel like everything's decided. There's still a lot of time to talk and pop out and go into other community groups and ask them the same questions.
Well, you say the area is 5 acres, and that's
It's-
all. Is it commensurate with what was taken?
It's possible we could put a cap over top of the whole thing. That would be 12 acres. I don't know that that's going to happen.
And why
But-
not?
Because there's going to be a certain amount of cost involved, and I don't know how much funding we'll be able to get. The other problem would be if you covered the entire area, it would become a tunnel, and that would require a much more expensive installation of ventilation and other things from the unfortunate, the automobiles are still traveling underneath that tunnel. So that's another consideration that we have to deal with as well, if we were to cap the entire thing.
So you just peacemaking.
Well, we're going to try to put,
I just think that if they would see, I lived in Baltimore when they did the same thing. And I'm asking the same kind of questions I asked there. And I just wanted to know. They didn't replace anything in Baltimore.
well,
So
I would,
just wanted to know if they were going to be space would be commensurate with what they took.
well, all I can say is we haven't decided that yet, how much is going to be put back. But we are going to have to cope with I-95 being underneath whatever it is we build.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Lucy. And Bob, I think you were asking a question, so.
I'm
go
going
right ahead.
to simply give David 3 because I know we're short on time. Solar, if you're going to have bright lights and this is going to be environmentally sensitive, just that solar is somehow incorporated. I know that your folks are creative regarding that. And Delaware Housing Authority and the Delaware Housing Coalition. The Housing Coalition is the hub for how we address homelessness. And I hope that they are actively present, maybe they are already actively present in the center of the conversation, because they are the experts on how we deal with people that are homeless, and their engagement is just wise. And of course, the Housing Authority, when you talk about things like redoing faces of housing, they're creative people, and are they engaged already? Then I'll just shut up.
No, we're not, but I'm very thankful that you passed that on to me, because I didn't know who to reach out to. And I
Yeah.
said, I'm a transportation professional, so it changes, but this is good. This is something I can follow up with. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Bob.
you'll get the Housing Authority will be fascinated by this, and they'll have creative ideas, and the coalition as well. So God bless you for a wonderful presentation. You are articulate, but you show throughout your talk a deep sensitivity to listening to the community and respecting all people who are engaged. And that is something that comes from your soul, not from your training in school. That comes from your heart, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you, Bob. I've been working in Wilmington a long time, and this is a really great opportunity to do something that's meaningful and will benefit not just one community, but actually a bunch of communities. So it's nice to have the opportunity. I thank you. And I'm certainly willing, Sue, to re-engage with this group as we go through the process.
That would be great. That would be great, Dave.
Yeah, and I will keep, you can be my point of contact, I guess, to do outreach. If anybody has questions and contacts you as a follow-up, please point them to my email, which you now have, because again, the goal is to keep getting feedback. And we are looking for other pop-up opportunities within the community. So if other people who are attending this call have ideas of other places we can go and kind of get the outreach and get people connected to the project, I'm certainly open to that.
I just wanted to add one other thought to all of this, and it was triggered by Roger's original question about the renters and the owners. One of the things that we know was an outgrowth of the actions of implementation of the GI Bill and the FHA loan insurance was that Black people were not able to get mortgages or home improvement loans. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, in an essay he wrote back in 2014 about reparations, spoke to systemic reparations, not checks to individuals per se, but the idea of offering zero interest loans for home improvement, for home purchases, to people who were disadvantaged by the lack of basically opportunity to buy homes. And so perhaps there is some financial instrument that could be made available to people living in these communities who don't have the wherewithal to either buy their homes or improve their homes. There might be a separate source of funding that would help with that aspect of kind of the stability of the residents in the neighborhood.
I think Delaware Housing Authority would be among the people that understand the process for that. And there's another group that I'm not remembering that deals with energy. And I apologize for not having it at the tip of my tongue, but I'll get it to you, Sue, because they deal with the structure of housing vis-a-vis weatherization, insulation, and people being able to save money. And they do solar with 0% and no money down. So it might be helpful.
Great.
I'll pass it
Well,
along.
I want to add my thanks to everybody else's to Dave. Dave, this was a really great presentation. I remember when I first heard about this as an issue, and that some cities and states were actually tearing up interstates. They were removing them. And when I first heard about it, I thought, oh, what if I-495 or whatever that road goes around Wilmington became I-95? Well, it was too late because we were already putting millions of dollars into fixing up I-95. And it was sort of like, oh, I could have had a V8, you know. Only
Yeah. Yeah.
But this idea, I think, is wonderful. And certainly engaging the community the way you are and having the support from the top down, I think it's brilliant, and I can't wait to see the progress and the results. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And again, yeah, absolutely. And I encourage any comments. If you can filter those through, Sue, if other people have other ideas, we'd love to hear them. But thank you for having me, and look to stay in touch with you.
Great. Thank you
so
all.
much.
Have a good evening.
All right. Thanks,
Good
everyone.
night.
Blessings to everybody. Thank you again, Dave.